All right, great. So I'm very excited about this next panel that's coming up as well. This one is, I'm sorry, Shikha is going to be the keynote speaker, leading us into our third panel. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit about Shikha real quick before I share a quote by her. But Shikha Dalmia, excuse me, is a senior analyst at Reason Foundation, which is a nonprofit think tank advancing free minds and free markets. The archive of her latest work can be found at reason.com. She's also a columnist at The Week and writes regularly for Reason magazine, excuse me. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share this amazing quote by Shikha, because I feel like it's a very good representation of what she's going to be talking about, but also just of what I know of her, which isn't too terribly much, but enough to feel that this is very, very on target. So immigrants and citizens' rights are inextricably linked. A government that assaults the rights of immigrants won't for long respect those of citizens. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I think Shikha is completely correct. So I would love to just kick it right over to her from there. I'm sure she has a great deal to say about this as well. So thank you so much, Shikha.
Thank you, Jamila. And thank you all for coming today for this excellent conference. And thanks to the Free Migration Project for hosting it and inviting me. I suppose congratulations are also in order to all of us here who fought Donald Trump's second term. His hopes of keeping Stephen Miller in the White House are dripping away faster than Rudy Giuliani's hair dye, and that's a good thing. We have defeated the most racist and vile administration in living memory that turns the border into a horror show. If anyone had suggested in 2012 that 5 years later, America would be snatching infants from the breasts of migrant moms, we'd have thought that they were under some paranoid delusion caused by the consumption of crack cocaine. But there was the Trump administration in 2017 with its zero tolerance border policy. It separated about 5,000 families and has yet to reunite about 550 of them. There is a term for this kind of thing, crimes against humanity. How was this possible in America, the alleged land of the free? Here's the reason. When you criminalize a victimless activity, everything becomes fair game. The logic is the same, whether it is the war on drugs or it is the war on immigration. The other speakers today will no doubt say more about what the war on immigration is doing to immigrants, its intended target. I'll focus my remarks on what it's doing to the unintended target, Americans and their liberties. Any attempt to control outsiders, I'm going to argue, will inevitably result in controlling insiders as well. One of my favorite libertarian thinkers, F.A. Hayek, he argued that when government interferes with the peaceful, voluntary economic activity of individuals to achieve some larger state end, it puts the country on the road to serfdom. It doesn't matter whether these ends are lofty ones like eradicating income inequality or conservative ones like cultural preservation by restricting trade and immigration. If these restrictions leave individuals substantially worse off, they will find a way to circumvent them, unleashing all kinds of unintended consequences. But the government's failure to achieve its ends will not be perceived as evidence that there is something wrong with these ends, that perhaps they are out of sync with the legitimate aspirations of people. Rather, the failure will be blamed on an insufficient use of force in achieving ends that are otherwise good. Thus, an initial round of coercion spawns ever more draconian subsequent rounds, putting the country on the path to serfdom or a police state. Usually, depending on the health of a society, humanity kicks in at some point to prevent this logic from turning into the Holocaust. But every once in a while, a sociopath comes along and pushes it down the slippery slope, and atrocities ensue. But the question is, why does state violence inevitably have to escalate? Why doesn't the initial crackdown just succeed as it was intended? And the answer is, when laws deem acts that have actual victims as crime, they are for the most part self-enforcing. The government has strong buy-in from the public, and the vast majority of people obey these laws spontaneously and automatically. Indeed, most people don't go around killing, stealing, pillaging, and raping. So authorities have to go after only a very small number of violators, which in functioning polities is a manageable thing. However, it is very hard to obtain that kind of automatic buy-in for victimless crimes that are crimes only because some government has said they are crimes. Too many people are either indifferent to these laws, or they actually profit by subverting them, or they actively oppose them, like all of us are doing. Think about it this way. If enough Americans really didn't want to have anything to do with immigrants, immigrants wouldn't come into this country. They couldn't live in this country. They couldn't survive in this country. They wouldn't be able to get jobs. They wouldn't be able to get married. They wouldn't have kids. But that is not the case. For every immigrant, there are a whole host of Americans who benefit from his or her presence. So in order to enforce this rule of law, authorities can't rely on voluntary compliance. They have to resort to an ever-escalating, disproportionate, and therefore lawless use of force against Americans themselves. London School of Economics libertarian political theorist Chandran Pukathas notes, immigration controls are not merely border controls, but controls on the freedom of the population residing within those borders. The most vivid illustration of this, or the first at least, we've had many vivid illustrations since this one, is in Arizona, which thanks to the intersection of aggressive state laws and federal efforts, became ground zero for what is called interior enforcement. That's just a euphemistic term for hauling people away, using the force of the state from their homes and their loved ones and throwing them into the immigration detention complex and deporting them. This interior enforcement regime produced untold damage to the liberties of Americans, not just poor minorities, but also rich whites, not just liberals, but also Republicans. Everyone has heard of Arizona's SB 1070, the notorious Your Papers, Please law, that subjected the state's Latino community to widespread profiling and harassment. But 3 years before that law was passed in 2010, Arizona embraced LAWA, the Legal Arizona Workers Act. This law imposed business death penalties, the loss of operating licenses, for businesses that knowingly employed unauthorized immigrants. In other words, its aim was to save American jobs by shutting down American businesses. Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who is no one's idea of Andy Griffith, except maybe Donald Trump's, I guess, went to town with this law. He created a criminal employment squad to go after restaurants, car washes, janitorial cleaning services, small business enterprises that might have undocumented workers in their employ. In order to boost his image as tough on illegals ahead of a re-election campaign, he used his squad to raid not just the workplaces, but even the homes of business owners. His agents would swoop in, hand over anyone suspected of being undocumented to ICE, and they would arrest the owners of the establishment and also managers suspected of cooking the books. Over the course of a year, he went after about 80 workplaces and rounded up 800 people till his reign of terror became so out of control that a massive outcry forced him to back off. One established he went after was a restaurant called Uncle Sam, whose owner, actually, as it happened to be, was a card-carrying Republican who, excuse me, who was so popular with patriots, as blood and soil conservatives are locally called, that the local Republican club held its monthly meetings there. But Arpaio, to settle a vendetta, went after the restaurant owner on trumped-up charges and basically shut it down for a long time.
Shikha, do you mind slowing down a little bit so that the interpreter can interpret for you? Thank you.
And it's not just state authorities. federal interior enforcement is also decimating the liberties of ordinary Arizonians. A big chunk of Arizona is located in what the ACLU calls a constitution-free zone. This is a ban along the border, but stretching 100 miles into the interior, where the Supreme Court has given border control sweeping powers to search vehicles and luggage, just as it does at ports of entry. In effect, the border has moved inwards. Consider what the feds have done to one little border town called Arivaca. Arivaca is a little hamlet 11 miles from the Mexican border on the foothills of the San Luis Mountains. Its 800 residents are mostly white, but also some Hispanics who've lived there for generations. It's surrounded by beautiful rolling hills, ravines, and meadows. It has one grocery store and a restaurant, and that's about it. Border Patrol has wired the Mexico-facing side of the town with satellites and sensors to detect any movement in the ravines and meadows. It's a clear indication of the militarization of the border. But 10 years ago, or more like 13 years ago at this stage, it decided to set up what they called a temporary checkpoint on the other side of the town under the guise of gaining operational control of the border. The stated purpose of this checkpoint was to protect the residents from the illegal flow of drugs and migrants. In fact, the checkpoint has made Arivaca residents feel like they are living in the West Bank. They have become the enemy because as far as Border Patrol is concerned, you never know when one of them will start hauling migrants for coyotes or human smugglers. The upshot is that anytime any Arivacan has to leave town to take their kid to the dentist, or to just go to work, they have to pass through this border checkpoint. If agents decide that they want to search their car, Arivacans can either voluntarily comply and let them look and get it over and done with quickly, or they can refuse and be detained till a canine team arrives to sniff their vehicle. That takes 45 minutes to an hour. In principle, agents need reasonable suspicion to stop anyone claiming to be an American citizen. In practice, if you are driving a sedan with a closed trunk rather than an open pickup truck, that can raise suspicion. If that truck has camping gear or heavy equipment, that can raise reasonable suspicion. If they don't make the required small talk with the agents at the checkpoint, that can raise reasonable suspicion. If they are too mouthy and they speak in a saucy manner, that can raise reasonable suspicion. Arivaca residents are so fed up that they have been agitating to get the checkpoint that was supposed to be temporary, remember, removed. These people are not open border libertarians like some of us, but they are really, really fed up with this regime of enforcement. There are such a dozen such checkpoints in Arizona and 100 or more nationwide. As if that's not bad enough, under Trump, ICE has obliterated many previously sacred legal boundaries. For example, literally every government everywhere recognizes that some sensitive locations, such as schools, courthouses, hospitals, and churches, are off limits to enforcement action because the mission of these entities, which is to serve everyone irrespective of their citizenship or social status, has to be respected. But except for churches, the Trump administration has picked up illegals in all these places. And for churches, they actually just wait outside till anybody who's taking sanctuary comes out, and then they'll haul them away. So not too much deference shown. If you guys haven't watched the brilliant documentary Immigration Nation that captures some of the ICE's really chilling tactics in real time, you all should do it. But not just illegals, but also Americans aiding and abetting them are fair game. Everyone's heard of the story of Scott Warren, a university professor in Arizona and humanitarian worker at the No More Death camps in the Sonora Desert, where he was administering first aid to some lost border crossers and he was arrested. Warren was arrested and tried because he violated federal anti-harboring laws and let 3 exhausted migrants stay at the camp for 3 days till they recuperated rather than just shooing them away. The purpose here is clear. Send a signal to aid workers that if they help migrants, the feds will come for them. No more deaths camp has been abandoned because aid workers are now afraid of being arrested. But the lesser known, though perhaps even more chilling case is that of Nancy Wynn, who heads Viet Li, another outfit that fights for migrants' rights, just like the Free Migration Project. One evening last month, Nancy recounts Philadelphia police officers, in collaboration with federal law enforcement agents, came to her house in the evening, just when she was changing the diaper of her 18-month-old infant, and it arrested her right in front of her 3-year-old. She was hauled into a police van, and then she was showed a warrant authorizing her arrest for trespassing and dumping, or which is just another word for littering. What was this all about? Apparently, in September, she had participated in a protest outside the home of ICE acting director Tony Pham, a Vietnamese refugee with a long career in law enforcement. Nancy, who's an American citizen of Vietnamese descent herself, allegedly placed signs on Pham's lawn protesting ICE's treatment of federal immigration detainees. That's it. That's all she did. A massive community-wide outcry finally secured her release after a day. But if she can be targeted, literally no one here in attendance is safe. They can come after any one of us at any time. It doesn't matter whether we are citizen or not. So how can a country that prides itself on protecting individual liberty against state tyranny come to this? Why aren't patriots up in arms over this creeping police state? There is a logic of otherization and us versus them mentality that ultimately eats its own, and that's what's at work over here. It begins with considering immigrants as the other or them and Americans as us. But Nancy Wynn is an American citizen, so shouldn't her rights matter? No, because she's of Vietnamese descent. So she's clearly not one of us. But what about Warren, who I'm guessing from his name is of European heritage? Well, he's a long-haired hippie liberal, so he don't matter either, I guess. Ultimately, this mentality can justify an unlimited expansion of the police state. It becomes the state and its enablers versus everyone else. States like Texas and Ohio have proposed laws that seek to arrest duly elected mayors and leaders if they refuse to cooperate with federal deportation efforts or criticize anti-sanctuary policies. Talk about subverting democracy. It didn't begin with Donald Trump, although he may have taken it to a whole new height. Arizona is considering a law to freeze the assets of pro-immigration protesters. The feds have weakened due process and made detention and deportation of anyone suspected of being in the country illegally so easy that about 4,000 American citizens are getting caught in the dragnet and being deported annually to countries that they don't know. None of this should be surprising. Such assaults on the liberties of citizens are not a bug, but a feature of an aggressive immigration enforcement regime. Immigrants and citizens are therefore, rights are therefore inextricably linked, and government has to either respect everyone's rights or no one. And in the escalating war on immigration, the government is choosing the second course. It's time to call it off and open the borders, or the next Trump will pick off exactly where this one is leaving off. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I see Fabio just popped up. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Fabio for the Q&A. Thank you, Fabio.
Oh, no problem. I'm just going to scan the comments. And, an anonymous attendee just wanted to say that no more death camps isn't actually abandoned. The work has vigorously continued in spite of regression. Maybe, Shikha, you could elaborate more a little bit about these 4,000 American citizens who've been caught up in this dragnet. And I also want to take a moment to encourage viewers to use the comment section and type in their comments, and then we'll call from that.
Thank you for that correction, whoever the commenter was. That's good to know. Last time I had checked, the camp had been disbanded, but I'm very, very glad to hear that it's reopened now. As to the 4,000 Americans who are being deported, there's Northwestern professor Jackie Stevens, who's actually been documenting this and doing really excellent work, keeping track of all this. And, basically, the story is the same. I've written about this. The harsh and the aggressive enforcement regime has basically authorized ICE agents and detention, CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, to stop anyone they don't like. Anybody who doesn't look like a purebred American, has a slight accent, or talks weird, and if they don't buy their idea that they are citizens, or if these people don't vociferously right at the first encounter claim that they are citizen, they just throw them into detention. And in detention, if you have any experience with it, immigration law and citizen law are two different things. Immigrants don't have any of the due process rights to legal representation, the normal court processes that citizens are allowed. So once you get, even if you're a citizen and you get classified as an immigrant, you can't get the same kind of legal representation that you would if you were actually in a prison rather than a detention center. So many of, the 4,000 people who are getting deported every year, they tend to be, of course, minorities, of course, of Latino descent, because, they are not from here. I mean, they're suspected as not being from America. And they are, of course, poor because they can't, their relatives can't move, and they are unconnected. So their relatives can't move heaven and earth in order to find them, locate them. And so these people get deported to countries that they don't know at all. So one of the stories that Jacqueline Stevens tells is of like this older Hispanic man who got deported to Mexico, a country that he didn't know. He had no skills over there that would allow him to work there. He was undocumented in Mexico. So he was being given a hard time by Mexican authorities. He had no means of earning a livelihood. And he ended up scavenging trash cans just to find food to live. I mean, so this is the kind of thing that we are tolerating. And unless, we bring back protections for immigrants, more and more Americans are going to keep getting caught in this dragnet.
So the next comment is from Charlene Belsom-Zelmer.
I'm sorry, one moment. Can we just need to slow it down just a bit for interpretation? Okay. I just want to stop for a second. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's wait for interpretation to catch up. Wait a second. So this is from Charlene Belsom-Zelmer, who says, ICE detained a man on church grounds in Maryland in September, putting sensitive locations completely at risk across institutions. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that kind of targeting of institutions from your experience.
Mm-hmm. So that's really distressing. I actually didn't know that. And if you can forward me that, that case, I would like to pursue it. I actually thought that that's one boundary that the Trump administration was respecting, was actually going into churches. I know they've gone into hospitals and they've gone into schools and they have, hauled away parents and they have hauled away patients who are in critical condition. I think there was this one incident in Texas where, little infant was in distress and her parents were undocumented. And their parents, rushed this infant to a hospital, and somebody at the hospital or somebody alerted ICE to the fact that, the parents were undocumented and ICE came and hauled them away. So that kind of thing has been happening for a while. Now, legally, it has never, churches are public spaces. So legally, the government is within its rights to go in and haul people out of churches. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that just out of respect. It was just a norm. And, that the government will not go into, a house of worship and haul people away, because house of worship are supposed to be above, this kind of law enforcement. I mean, criminals, hardened criminals can go and worship, and the authorities will stay away. So this is really distressing that, that the Trump administration should have reached that boundary. And this is not a boundary that is only obeyed in America. World over, every civilized country has this boundary that there are some lines we are not going to cross because, there is some higher purpose at stake over here. So, that's very, very distressing that they should have gone into a church.
So thank you to Charlene for posting the Washington Post article, which is in the chat room. We can forward that to Shikha later, where we can save it for you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, the next comment is anonymous. Thank you for speaking. Regarding your point, where are the patriots who believe in individual freedom? Why haven't they commented on the encroachment of freedoms at the border? How should we engage those folks in this conversation without pandering to their possibly racist intentions?
It's a very good question. And, I really don't have a good answer to it. Argument doesn't work with them. I mean, you can't appeal to their principles because, people can talk themselves into anything. These same patriots, who are four square behind these kinds of really harsh and inhumane enforcement tactics, when it comes to immigration, are also the same patriots who will not wear a mask because, that's an affront to their freedom, even though that might endanger others around them, right? You have sheriffs in this country who are cooperating with ICE and federal authorities against sanctuary cities in their own states. But they are refusing to, for instance, in Michigan, where I used to live, Governor Whitmer, had some curfews and some restrictions during the height of coronavirus. Some of those were quite misguided, so I don't mean to defend her over here. Some of them were, really quite wrong. But there was a hue and cry against them, and many of these same patriots were outraged. And you know what happened? Some of them even tried to kidnap her because they were so incensed. Some sheriffs refused to enforce some of Gretchen Whitmer's curfew restrictions. Now, these are these same sheriffs that will cooperate with ICE. So, they kind of find ways to kind of justify this complete, what in my view is like a schizophrenia, maximal state action for minimal crimes and minimal state actions in the face of something, that could be a dangerous activity. The only answer I can give you is, engage them at the human level. I think people respond to human stories. These people, sometimes, you find common ground just when you least expect it. To tell you the story of a quick story, I have this very wealthy lady who's from Cuba, or whose father came from Cuba. So she is of Cuban ancestry, and she considers herself a patriot, a card-carrying Republican, voted for Donald Trump. But one day she was over at my place, and, we started talking about just sort of like people who come over, for help. And she said she had this cleaning lady who had been coming to her for a long time. She didn't know what her status was. And then suddenly it turned out she was out of status. And this lady, who's this card-carrying patriot, Cuban heritage, Trump supporter, was suddenly appalled. I mean, she didn't, she actually went to bat for this lady whom she, kind of loved and had taken in her wing. So, I think it's kind of, you can't engage them at the level of an argument or principles. They'll always have some way of, rationalizing that. But humanity is powerful. I mean, I think that's kind of what eventually, caused Trump to end his child separation policy, is because even people, who were not necessarily opposed to harsh interior enforcement tactics, once the inhumanity of it became apparent, I think they too kind of like backed off.
So I just want to remind people to please use the comments. Azadeh Irfani, I'm sorry, the screen is very small. They say, really appreciate your call to think about how immigrants and citizens' rights are inextricably linked. In the US, it took a lot of bloodshed to define who counts as a citizen. Wondering if you could speak to how the definition of immigrant is also increasingly racialized and problematic, especially when viewed as a binary relation to citizen.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It is, in my view, a mentality that wants to, an us versus them mentality will always find a way to express itself. So just to tell you what's happening in my native country, India, right? We never had an immigration problem. I mean, India isn't, is not like a sort of like America, where a lot of influx of people. The only the influx of immigrants you have in India is from neighboring countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, occasionally Pakistan, Afghanistan, at the height of the Cold War. And, when Russia was in Afghanistan, there was an influx of refugees from Afghanistan to India. So there's never been an immigration issue in India, as there has always been in the United States, until about 5 years ago, when the current Modi administration decided that it's sort of, I don't know how much people know about the Modi administration, but it's a Hindu nationalist administration. And sort of, a nationalist is even not a right term, it's a Hindu chauvinist administration. And its entire agenda is sort of otherizing the Muslims. And so it created this, it decided it was going to create this national registry of citizens versus non-citizens. And the non-citizens, which it said were, undocumented immigrants who were living in the country, were going to be thrown into detention camps. And what was its criteria for who was a citizen and who was a non-citizen? If you could show that you have documents showing that your ancestors have been living over there for a long time, then you will be considered a citizen. Now, the problem with that was that there are lots of Muslims who have been living in India for generations. And also the other problem is that not very many Indians have this kind of documentation. It's a very informal society. People don't even know their birth dates, let alone have birth certificates or their ancestors' birth certificates. So the Modi government did another thing, which is that, okay, if you are Hindu or Christian or any other religious group or ethnic group, well, we'll give you, amnesty, and you'll immediately become citizens. But if you're Muslim, you will not. So, so this was a mentality that turned actual citizens into foreigners on their own land. So when you have a mentality like this, when you have a binary, us versus them, citizen versus, foreigner, it'll find a way to assert itself. And and there are other expressions of this mentality, right? I mean, it's not just us versus them, it's not just immigrant versus citizen. It can be anything. It can be this religion versus that religion. It can be, this ethnic group versus that ethnic group. So that's, so that mentality will always find a way to express itself in that way. In America, as the demographics change, immigrants are, when a power structure is entirely secure, it can be benevolent. So when whites, establishment felt that it was in control, it could be more, it could ignore the changing racial makeup of this country. As the racial makeup changes, and as the concerns of other ethnic minorities are not the same as the dominant majority starts feeling threatened. And the easiest way to otherize these other racial categories is by lumping them with immigrants, right? I mean, it's like sort of nativism is something very, very basic in the human psyche. It's, our club, we belong to it. And so, throwing in all kinds of racial categories into sort of the immigrant mix is a convenient way to maintain a certain kind of, domination, in my view.
Let's see, the next question comes from Arlene Grant. She says, thank you. How do you address immigrants who do not want undocumented immigrants to receive support? I see this issue in arguing in support of legislation to protect undocumented immigrants. There are loud cries from resident and naturalized citizens, which I cannot completely understand.
Yeah, that's kind of like one of the mistakes that our side makes. We think that, today's immigrants are tomorrow's immigrant supporters. So, as this country goes, from being predominantly white to some kind of a, white plurality, that somehow we'll have like people who are more hospitable to immigration. It's not how it works. Belonging to a club and protecting that club and, is a very, very deeply seated impulse in the human psyche. I mean, we have this tendency to think that this is the sort of this this sport of nativism that we are experiencing in America right now is because of like, whites are inherently, or uniquely prejudiced against other races. And so it's just sort of white racism. The fact is that every country is racist in its own way. It's more than racist, it's nativist in its own way. People who live in a country consider it to be some kind of a club, that has to be protected from outsiders. And so today's immigrants are tomorrow's restrictionists. They are not tomorrow's immigration friends of immigrants necessarily. And I have seen this myself in, the Indian American community, that those of us who have become naturalized or have green cards, they immediately start thinking of those who are trying to get here as, somehow, restrictions against them are legitimate. Somehow they start speaking the language of sort of the, the dominant group once they are admitted into the club. And so there is no, but I think there is a difference between, many of these people, I think, can be won over by, by just sort of giving them the facts. Many of them assume that they came in the right way and these other people are trying to come in the wrong way. This is very common argument in the Hispanic community, where they don't realize it, that there is no way for non-skilled foreign workers to be able to come to this country legally, that those options that they had or their grandparents had are no longer available. So some of that cohort can be convinced by sort of just arguments and facts. But the one that is doing so because they want to maintain this club called America and they want it to be an exclusive club, there's not that much you can do about that. You just have to try and marginalize them as much as you can by joining forces with the people who haven't yet made up their mind, or winning over people who haven't made up their mind. But once that mentality becomes sort of deep-seated, it's very hard to kind of dislodge it afterwards.
So I just want to remind people to use the chat room to please put your questions. I have another question for Shikha, which is now that we have a new administration coming in, and you're a journalist who has a lot of connections. Do you have any insight as to how the Biden administration will change things? Will they make it better, or will it be the same policy with a different packaging? So what is on the horizon?
So there is no universe in which the Biden administration will be as bad as the Trump administration on immigration. I mean, there was, this administration, no administration has been good on immigration. I think this is something maybe that might be a little bit taboo in this setting, but I think the last good president on immigration was Ronald Reagan. Clinton was horrible. We all know he was the president who actually criminalized immigration in ways that had not been criminalized before, created entirely, different ways of considering what, felony offense was, for instance. But, so the sort of this anti-immigration restrictionism, harsh enforcement regime had been creeping up. I mean, Obama was no friend of immigrants. George W. Bush was at first friendly with immigrants, and then he turned on immigrants. Obama administration was first unfriendly to immigrants, set records more than Trump when it came to deportation, and then became friendly to immigrants. Trump, by and large, has been hostile from day one. And there is literally he's the composite of badness of all previous presidents. So there is no way that the Biden administration is going to be as bad as Trump administration. The question is, what it'll do. And my feeling is he will, Biden, if you look at the immigration agenda for his first 100 days, it's basically undoing the harm that Trump has done through executive action. So he'll get rid of the Muslim travel ban. He'll get rid of, some of the restrictions on H-1Bs. He will set a higher quota for refugees. All of that he will do. The rest is going to just depend upon what kind of cooperation he gets from Congress. And I actually am kind of optimistic that we'll see some major change that's positive, just because one of the things that happened under Trump was there was such a collective revulsion against this regime of enforcement that he's actually kind of made most Americans more positively predisposed towards immigrants. So right now, if you look at the poll numbers, vast majority of Americans actually want more immigration. They don't think immigrants are a threat. They don't think immigrants bring disease and crime and all of that. And so if Biden plays his cards right, he could get some positive change, which is beyond simply undoing the damage that Trump has done and moving things in a positive way. I mean, I'm hoping he will, refugee program, he will do something about. I'm hoping at the skill, when it comes to, for instance, high-skilled immigrants right now, if you're an Indian American, you can spend your lifetime waiting for your green card and won't get it. Because there are quotas for each country. So if your country fills its quota every year and there's a backlog, well then tough. So there is this movement to remove this per country quota. And I think that's got legs, that may pass. So there may be a lot of peaceful, positive change.
So I just want to remind people to please use the chat box. I think another comment just came up from Tyler. Do you think there will be change in public opinion with respect to immigration during the Biden administration? So I think you're already getting into that. Maybe you could expound more on changes on public opinion.
We'll see. It depends, I suppose, on how Biden goes about his, his immigration agenda. One of the things I was super disappointed with the Biden campaign was that he didn't make Trump.
I'm sorry, Shikha, to interrupt, but it's like muffled. Something is muffled with the speaker all of a sudden. I'm just letting you know so that it's clear. Thank you.
Okay, is this better? Is this better, Jamila?
Not for me, but maybe others are not experiencing this.
I can hear a little bit of wind, like a blowing through it.
Okay, okay.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay, great. Sorry, I just want to make sure that everyone could hear you. Thank you.
Is this better?
This is perfect.
I had a ceiling fan on.
Yes.
I understand. Thank you so much.
To some extent, it'll depend upon how Biden plays his cards. I was disappointed that he didn't make immigration more of an issue in the election, especially given what Trump had done. They both kind of like, Trump in his campaign and Biden in his campaign largely stayed away from the whole subject. So Biden didn't go out of his way to call Trump out on some of, his border atrocities, which means that he doesn't really have a mandate right now to push immigration than if he had actually made this a campaign issue. So that's kind of one problem. And, it's just in the nature of things when Trump was overly harsh on immigration, public sentiment was pro-immigration. Now, if Biden is pro-immigration, the other side might be able to make some headway with public opinion and undo some of the positive feelings towards immigrants that had emerged during Trump's time. So, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see whether the change in a pro-immigration direction during Trump was just sort of like a temporary ephemeral thing that's going to evaporate once Biden gets into office, or it's going to stick. I don't have any predictions.
So just reminding people, we have just a couple of minutes left. If there's no other comment, then I'll ask Shikha maybe to kind of summarize what are one or two big take-home points from all the reporting. And you've written a lot on immigration. Maybe you could summarize for people who don't know your work, what are the big take-home points for you? And then maybe we could wrap up the session or take a last question after that.
I comment on breaking news on immigration as it breaks. So I cover every aspect of the issue. So it's hard to have like just one or two takeaways. What I will say is that I have not seen the conversation on immigration turn as toxic and, just sort of foul as it did during the Trump administration. That was something that I was caught unawares of, with. I'm not sure, I'm still struggling to understand how the Trump administration could have got us to the point that we have. I think America is a good country. It's basically decent people. And so how could they have, been pulled along some directions of some of his, what can be best be called crimes against humanity. And I'm struggling to understand how that happens. This has happened in America and has also happened in India, where good, decent people start going along with just the harshest, the worst, the most inhumane policies. And I think it's because of this lack of appreciation of how we are all in it sort of together, that the state, some of us start thinking of the state and identifying with the state as an incarnation of who we are and our identity. Our identity gets tied with that of the state. When that happens, when our identity gets tied with whatever the state's goals and aims are, it becomes very, very easy to then demonize anybody who is not part of, the same goals and same aims. That's the logic, that you are seeing unfold over here. Patriots who are in sync with the aims of the Trump administration, they will just start to see everybody else as the enemy. Similar in India, where if you are not in favor of the Modi government's anti-Muslim agenda, well, then you are just the enemy. So this kind of like, this sort of this partitioning of the human psyche, of the human mind, is a very, very dangerous thing. And I, at least, that's what I'm going to struggle to understand going forward, and fight against and create markers against. What are the kinds of things that are happening in society that we need to watch out for, when our language changes in a certain way, right? When we start talking about employers and employers and people who are trying to make an honest living as just sort of, instead of being businesses or entrepreneurs, we start talking about them as profit seekers or corrupt, crooked individuals. That's something to watch out for. So what I'm going to be doing going forward is just sort of creating markers for when this shift in mentality happens, that when a free society and a free and decent people give up their own aims and make the state's aims as their own, and then start evaluating all the other people around them through that lens of the state. That's the danger point, and that's what that's what I want everybody to be alert to.
Okay, we have a comment from Orlando Lara. If the US them binary becomes a strong mechanism that creates nativism, do we need to start questioning citizenship as an institution itself, to start talking about opening citizenship, fundamentally transforming our understanding of what citizenship is, and how we construct borders around it? Should we abolish citizenship borders?
Okay, I have to, that's a big question. Not sure I can do it justice in a few minutes. I mean, look, this is just, I don't know if I have anything useful to say on this. On one hand, if you have open borders, right, you can still have citizenship. Open borders only means allowing people to go back and forth without restrictions. That doesn't mean that necessarily everybody, who's in a country will get a piece of paper from the authority saying that they are citizens. Whether citizenship should have any meaning at all, I mean, I think it should. If we, there's a simple matter of elections and who votes. I'm okay with extending that voting rights to anybody who's in a country, who can, I don't know, pass some very minimal test. It doesn't have to be have to be formal citizenship, but maybe if you are just somebody hasn't killed, who's not a serial killer, and have some something at stake in the country where you are living, maybe you should be given voting rights. Yeah, I mean, it's all worth thinking about, I think. But I just want open borders right now, which means let people come and go without getting a paper from, piece of paper from the government saying that you are able to come and go in that fashion. But many other countries actually don't have this binary of citizen versus non-citizen. Even in America, you don't necessarily have that binary, right? I mean, you do have citizens, but then you have green card holders, and then you have workers who have visas to work in the country. In Singapore, in a way, also, you don't have sort of like citizens versus non-citizen. You have sort of this continuum of rights, with citizens having the most rights, and then in political rights and other kinds of due process rights, but everybody else having due process rights, but not political rights. To then, some immigrants who have just very, very few rights. They have sort of a layered approach. The advantage of the layered approach is that in some ways it gets native buy-in for keeping more generous immigration policies and opening the borders more. So tactically, strategically, if you want to make a difference to the lives of people in poor countries who just want to come here and work, that might be politically a better tactic to take this more layered approach. But I'm also perfectly aware that when you have this kind of layered approach, you may solve some problems, but then you create other incentives and traps for human right violations. So I don't know how it all, so, I don't have any finished thoughts on this. I just know sort of like, there are advantages and disadvantages to thinking about it in different ways.
Yeah, so we have just a few minutes left, and I just want to remind everybody that our next panel on how emergencies shape immigration policy will be coming up at 3:45 p.m. So after the room is closed and the room will reopen at 3:45, please come back to that panel. And I want to see if there's any last comments, so please use the comment box. We only have a minute or two left. So maybe the last thing you can wrap up with, Shikha, is what is your next project going to be about? Like, what's the next series of stories about immigration or other topics that you're going to do? And then we can say goodbye to the audience.
I am very interested in this whole phenomenon of populist authoritarianism that has emerged on the right. And immigration has been sort of like the core flashpoint issue that's generated this populist authoritarianism, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether it's in India, or whether it's in the United States. So I want to study animosity towards immigrants as a flashpoint for populist demagoguery. What is the connection over there? Why immigrants? Why have all these various demagogues zeroed in on immigrants as a way to advance whatever their personal ambitions or their other political agenda? What is it about immigrants that gives them this kind of traction and and propels them? So that's kind of going to be my next project. I'm going to think about this, and I'm going to write articles about this, and so that's where I'm going. And of course, I'm going to cover the Biden administration and what it does on immigration. I'll have pieces that'll lay out, sort of in their agenda, what they should do in the first 100 days in order to move the issue forward in a useful direction. So I'll be covering day-to-day immigration policy, as well as thinking about this big thing as to why populist demagogues always start beating up on immigrants. Why them?
Well, I wanted to say thank you so very much for taking time out on this gloomy afternoon. 3:45 will be our next panel. I'll hand it over to our MC, who will do a little housekeeping. Thank you very much for such an excellent talk, and please follow Shikha on social media.
Yes, please do. And thank you very much, Fabio, Jamila, and Free Migration Project. Keep up the great work.